Welcome back, drama hunters. And if you're new here, a huge welcome to the Daily Drama Stories, your ultimate destination for jaw-dropping true stories of HOA overreach and the epic battles against it. Before we dive into today's unbelievable tale, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you're always the first to find out when our latest daily drama hits the screen. All right, let's get into this video. Amber stood on the weathered dock, the morning sun glinting off the calm lake. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent she had known her entire life. This place, her grandfather's cabin, was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary, a repository of memories. He had built it with his own two hands, a testament to his love for this serene patch of land. Now it was hers. The deed was signed, the will was settled, and she was officially the owner of this sprawling 4-acre lakeside paradise. She'd spent her childhood summers here, learning to fish, to skip stones, and to appreciate the quiet majesty of nature. Her grandfather, a man of few words but profound wisdom, had taught her everything she knew about living off the land, about respecting your neighbors, and about the sheer joy of a simple life. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose word was his bond, and he had been a constant presence in the lives of everyone who lived on the lake. His death had left a void not just for Amber, but for the entire neighborhood. But now, a new presence had taken over, a blight on the landscape of her happy memories. Home, the spot of earth supremely blessed, a dearer, sweeter spot than all the rest. The quote, one of her grandfather's favorites, echoed in her mind, but it felt hollow now. The HOA, or more accurately, its self-appointed monarch, had been a thorn in her grandfather's side for years. He had always been able to handle her with a combination of charm, wit, and a quiet stubbornness that had made her retreat in frustration. But Amber was not her grandfather. She was a beautiful 25-year-old woman who had just graduated with a degree in real estate law, a fact that she knew would either be her greatest weapon or her biggest weakness in the coming conflict. The HOA president, a woman named Karen Ponsonby, was a caricature of a villain. She was a woman who had a perpetual scowl etched onto her face, a woman who saw regulations not as guidelines, but as instruments of control. She had moved into the community 5 years ago and had immediately set about trying to improve it, which in her lexicon meant turning it into a soulless, cookie-cutter suburb. Her first target had been the ancient oak tree in the community park, which she claimed was a safety hazard. It had been her grandfather who had rallied the community, reminding them of the tree's history and its significance. He had won that battle, but the war, it seemed, was far from over. The first volley was a letter, a thick, official-looking document with the HOA's logo emblazoned on the top. It arrived 2 days after she took ownership. Amber, still surrounded by boxes and the melancholic ghost of her grandfather, opened it with a sense of dread. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressiveness. It welcomed her to the community, then immediately launched into a litany of pending violations. The dock, a solid, well-maintained structure her grandfather had built decades ago, was non-compliant with current structural guidelines. The paint on the cabin, a faded but charming shade of blue, was not within the approved color palette. The 4 acres of land, a wild and beautiful mix of native flora, was unmaintained and in violation of our landscaping regulations. It was a bold-faced lie, a blatant attempt to intimidate her. She knew this because she had spent the last 2 months poring over the HOA documents with her grandfather's lawyer, making sure everything was in order. The documents, as it turned out, were her second weapon. Karen Ponsonby, a woman who considered herself a master manipulator, had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated Amber. She saw a young woman, a city girl, who would be easily intimidated and manipulated. She saw a quick flip, a chance to buy a prime piece of lakeside real estate for a fraction of its value, then sell it to a developer for a massive profit. Her LLC, a shell corporation she had set up specifically for this purpose, had already made discreet inquiries about the possibility of building luxury condominiums on the site. She saw a gold mine. Amber saw a home, a legacy, and a challenge. Amber's first move was to ignore the letter. She had learned from her grandfather that sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to refuse to engage. She spent the next week clearing brush, planting new flowers, and generally making the cabin her own. She painted the front door a vibrant shade of red, a color that was most certainly not in the HOA's approved palette. She knew she was poking the bear, but she also knew that the bear was going to come after her regardless. The red door was her declaration of war, a bright, defiant splash of color against the beige conformity Karen Ponsonby was trying to impose on the community. She was not going to be a victim. She was going to be a fighter. The second volley came in the form of a visit. Karen Ponsonby, a woman who rarely descended to walk among the plebeians, showed up on Amber's doorstep in a pristine white pantsuit, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a scepter. Her face was a mask of practiced concern, a look Amber recognized from the 1,000 bad reality TV shows. She smiled a tight, humorless smile. "Hello, Amber," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I'm Karen Ponsonby, the HOA president. I was just in the neighborhood and I saw your new additions. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of our community guidelines." Amber, who had expected her, smiled back. "Hello, Karen," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm very aware of the community guidelines. In fact, I've read them cover to cover. It's quite a fascinating document. Did you know it was last updated in 1995? It's a bit of a relic, really." The smile on Karen's face faltered. This was not the timid, intimidated young woman she had been expecting. This was a different animal entirely. "The guidelines are still in effect, Amber, and they are quite clear about the need for architectural conformity and landscape maintenance. Your grandfather, bless his heart, he was an old man. He had a few eccentricities. But you, as a new homeowner, have a fresh start. You can bring this property up to the standards our community expects." Amber leaned against the red door, her arms crossed. "Karen, my grandfather's eccentricities were what made this community special. He built this cabin with his own 2 hands. He planted those trees, and he maintained this property with more care than anyone I've ever known. The idea that this beautiful, vibrant piece of land needs to be brought up to standard is frankly insulting. And as for the guidelines, I'm quite certain that my grandfather's legacy, including this dock, this paint color, and this land, are all grandfathered in. I'm sure you're familiar with that term."
Karen's face, which had been a study in faux concern, now turned a shade of puce. She was not used to being challenged, especially not by a beautiful young woman who was supposed to be a pushover. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said, her voice a low growl. "The grandfather clause only applies to the original structure. Any and all changes, including paint colors, require prior approval. And as for the dock, it's a safety hazard. It's leaning, and it's a liability for the entire community." Amber laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that seemed to shatter the pristine silence of Karen's indignation. "Karen, my grandfather built that dock stronger than a fortress. It has withstood 3 hurricanes, 2 floods, and countless overenthusiastic cannonballs from my cousins. It's not leaning, it's just rustic. And as for the liability, I'm more than willing to sign a waiver. I'm quite certain my grandfather's lawyer, who is also my lawyer, has already prepared one." The mention of a lawyer and the fact that Amber had already anticipated her arguments seemed to drain the wind from Karen's sails. She looked at the red door, a symbol of defiance, and then at Amber, who was standing there, calm and confident, and she knew she had miscalculated. This was not going to be a quick, easy victory. This was going to be a war. "We'll see about that, young lady," she said, her voice a hiss. "The board will be in touch." She turned and stalked away, her pristine white pantsuit a jarring sight against the natural beauty of the lakeside. Amber watched her go, a slow smile spreading across her face. Her grandfather had been right. Sometimes all it takes is a little bit of defiance to make a bully back down. But she knew this was just the beginning. The HOA, or more specifically, Karen Ponsabini, was not going to give up so easily. The prize, a prime piece of lakeside real estate, was too great, and the woman who now owned it was a beautiful 25-year-old woman who was a beautiful 25-year-old woman who wasn't afraid to fight. It is in the shelter of each other that the people live, her grandfather had often said. Amber knew that if she was to win this battle, she would have to find her own shelter, her own allies, in a community that had been cowed into submission by a tyrant. The game, as her grandfather would have said, was afoot. And she, a beautiful 25-year-old woman who had just inherited her grandfather's lakeside cabin with 4 acres of land and a dock on the lake, was ready to play. She knew that her grandfather's legacy was more than just his house. It was the people who lived in this community, the people he had loved and protected. Now, it was her turn to do the same. The next day, Amber found a formal notice taped to her vibrant red door, a single sheet of paper held fast by a piece of industrial-strength duct tape that had clearly been chosen for its ability to leave a sticky, impossible-to-remove residue. It was a new violation notice, this time for the unauthorized alteration of the property's architectural facade. The fine, helpfully outlined in bold, all-caps lettering, was $500. Amber peeled the paper off, leaving a stubborn, gummy stain on the beautiful wood, and smiled. It was a paltry sum, an annoyance, but not a threat. It was a declaration of war, and Amber was now officially a combatant. She took a picture of the notice, then another of the gummy residue, and sent it to her lawyer, who was also her grandfather's lawyer, with a simple text: "Let the games begin." Karen Ponsabini, it seemed, was not a woman who believed in a slow, strategic campaign. She was a woman who believed in a full frontal assault. The second wave came a week later, a flurry of notices for every conceivable violation. The bird feeder that hung from an ancient oak was a nuisance and attracted unwanted wildlife. The wind chimes, a gift from her grandmother, were a noise pollution hazard. The rowboat tied to her dock, a relic from her grandfather's youth, was an unauthorized vessel. The fines, which she meticulously tallied, now totaled nearly $2,000. Amber, sitting on her porch swing with a cup of coffee, watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder, its brilliant red a defiant splash of color against the green. She smiled again. Her grandfather had always said, "The first casualty of war is innocence." Amber, it seemed, had officially lost hers. But she wasn't just a combatant. She was a law student. She knew that every battle, no matter how small, was won with preparation and strategy. She also knew that Karen's tactics were a smokescreen, a prelude to the real play. The fines were a nuisance, a way to pressure her, to make her life miserable, to make her want to sell. But Amber knew the real prize was not a compliance fee. It was the land itself. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that Karen's focus on her property wasn't just about making the community look better. It was about something far more insidious. And Amber, a beautiful 25-year-old woman who had just inherited her grandfather's lakeside cabin with 4 acres of land and a dock on the lake, was not going to give it up without a fight. She started her own investigation. She went to the community's public library, a quiet, dusty place that was a testament to the old-world charm her grandfather had loved. She spent hours poring over old newspaper articles, community newsletters, and the minutes from old HOA meetings. She found articles about her grandfather, a man who had not only built his own home, but had helped countless others in the community with their own projects. A man who had fought for the preservation of the community's natural beauty. She found a quote from one of the founding members, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had said, "This community is not about rules, it's about respect. It's about being good neighbors and looking out for one another." The quote, so full of genuine warmth, was a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal notices now being taped to her door. Amber was a woman on a mission, and she was not going to stop until she found what she was looking for. And then she found it. a small, seemingly insignificant article from the local business journal buried deep in a microfiche file. It was an announcement about a new LLC, Lakeside Development Solutions, a company that specialized in acquiring and developing lakeside properties in the area. The managing director, a woman named Karen Ponsabini. The address was a P.O. box. Amber felt a cold dread creep up her spine.
This was it. This was the real reason for the harassment, the fines, the endless barrage of nonsense. Karen didn't want to fix the community, she wanted to own it. Or at least she wanted to own the most valuable piece of it. Amber's 4 acres of prime lakeside real estate. This was not a community dispute, it was a business transaction, and Amber was standing in the way of a very large payday. The world is a stage, but the play is badly cast, she muttered to herself, her grandfather's favorite quote echoing in her mind. It was a perfect description of the situation she now found herself in. The next week, the lowball offer arrived. It was in a thick, legal-sized envelope, sent via certified mail. The letter was from Lakeside Development Solutions, and it made an offer to purchase her property for what was a ridiculously low price, a fraction of what she knew the land was worth. The letter spoke of the difficulties of maintaining a property of this size and the financial burdens of ongoing HOA compliance fees. It was a thinly veiled threat, a carrot dangled on a stick, with the stick being the endless stream of fines and harassment. The letter ended with a seemingly benign postscript: "We are also prepared to cover any and all outstanding HOA fines upon the close of the sale." It was a clear, unambiguous admission of guilt, a tacit acknowledgement that Karen was using the HOA as a cudgel to force her hand. Amber felt a surge of cold fury. This woman was a shark, a predator in a pristine white pantsuit, and she was circling. But Amber had a secret weapon, a dusty, old box she had found in the attic, filled with her grandfather's old files. He had been a meticulous record keeper, a man who had saved everything, from old tax returns to ancient plat maps of the community. She had found a file labeled HOA Docs that was a treasure trove of information. There were copies of every single HOA document, every single bylaw, every single meeting minute, and every single plat map from the community's inception. He had even kept notes, handwritten in a spidery script, detailing the history of the land, the original developer, and the specific property lines. He had a note in the margin of a 1995 meeting minute that said, "Karen Ponsonby tried to change the bylaws to allow for commercial development. I stopped her." He had seen this coming. He knew even then that this woman was a snake in the grass. He had prepared for this, a battle he knew he would not live to fight. He had left her a map, a blueprint for victory. Amber, poring over the documents, found a key piece of information. The original plat map, a document from 1968, showed that her grandfather's property was not part of the original HOA. It had been annexed later with a special provision that grandfathered in all existing structures and land use. The fine print, which Karen had clearly either missed or ignored, stated that any changes to the grandfathered properties would require a 2/3 vote of the entire community, not just the HOA board. It was a technicality, a legal loophole that her grandfather, a man who had built this community and knew every single stone and tree, had placed there as a safeguard. He knew that someday someone would try to take this land, and he had made sure they would have a fight on their hands. With the legal documents in her hands, Amber went to her lawyer. He was an old man, a friend of her grandfather's, a man who had seen it all. He listened to her story, his eyes twinkling behind his thick glasses. He looked at the documents, his face a mask of quiet satisfaction. "Amber," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is not a fight. This is a checkmate. Your grandfather, that sly old fox, knew exactly what he was doing.
He didn't just build a home, he built a fortress, a legal fortress. This woman, this Karen Ponsonby, she's not just a bully, she's a fool. She's trying to play chess, but she doesn't even know the rules. Amber left his office with a new sense of purpose. She had a new weapon, a new strategy. She was no longer just a defender of her property. She was now an attacker. She was going to fight fire with fire. And she was going to use her grandfather's legacy, his wisdom, and his meticulous record-keeping to bring this woman down. The next move was hers, and she was going to make it count. She was going to use the community against their own president. She was going to expose the fraud, and she was going to make sure that Karen Ponsonby, a woman who considered herself a master manipulator, would be the one to get checkmated. Amber's plan was simple, yet brilliant. She would go to the community meeting and not only prove her innocence, but also expose Karen's fraudulent scheme to buy the land. She was going to use the very bylaws that Karen had used to harass her against her. This was going to be a battle for the soul of the community, and Amber was not going to let her grandfather's legacy be destroyed by a petty tyrant. She had a plan, a purpose, and a fire in her belly. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, and she was ready for battle. The moment Amber decided to go on the offensive, the game changed. It was no longer a matter of passive resistance. It was a matter of calculated surgical strikes. Her first move was to send a certified letter to the HOA board, a document crafted with the help of her grandfather's lawyer that was a masterpiece of legal jujitsu. It outlined in meticulous detail the violations of the HOA's own bylaws that Karen Ponsonby had committed. It cited the original plat map, the grandfather clause, and the fact that any changes to her property would require a 2/3 community vote. It was a formal declaration of her intent to fight, and it was signed not just by Amber, but by her lawyer, a man whose reputation in the community was as solid as her grandfather's. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. The quote, which she had found scrawled on the back of one of her grandfather's old notes, felt profoundly true. Karen Ponsonby was a woman of the present, of power and control, but Amber was a woman of the past, armed with the history and the foundation of this community, and she was about to use it as her weapon. Karen, predictably, went ballistic. She saw the letter not as a legal document, but as a personal insult, a challenge to her authority that could not be allowed to stand. She convened an emergency meeting of the HOA board, a clandestine affair held in her cavernous living room, where she could preside over the proceedings like a queen holding court. She presented the letter as an act of insolence, a deliberate attack on the integrity of the HOA, and she painted Amber as a rebellious newcomer, a young woman who did not understand or respect the traditions of the community. Her presentation was a tour de force of half-truths and outright lies. She talked about Amber's unmaintained land, her unsafe dock, and her defiant red door, all of which she claimed were a detriment to the community's property values. She did not, of course, mention the lowball offer from her own LLC, nor did she mention the legal precedent of the grandfather clause. She was a master of misdirection, a woman who knew how to play to the emotions of a group of people who were, for the most part, simply tired of dealing with conflict.
But Amber had an ally, a quiet, unassuming man named Frank, who lived across the lake. He was a retired land surveyor, a man who had known her grandfather for decades, and who had, in his quiet way, been a witness to Karen's reign of terror. He had seen the way she had bullied her neighbors, the way she had used her power for her own benefit, and he had been waiting for someone to stand up to her. When he heard about Amber's letter, he came to her with a box of his own, filled with old maps, surveys, and notes he had taken over the years.
He showed her how the original plat maps, which had been filed with the county and were a matter of public record, confirmed everything her grandfather had written. The 4 acres, the dock, and the grandfather clause were all legally binding, and Karen, as the HOA president, was not only violating the community bylaws, but also the law itself. Amber had now officially entered the fight with a full deck of cards, and she was ready to play her hand. The next salvo from Karen was a special assessment, a mandatory fee of $10,000 to fund a community revitalization project. The project, which she described in a slick, professionally produced brochure, was a plan to build a new community dock, a clubhouse, and a walking path around the lake. The cost, which she had conveniently estimated at a figure that was exactly the amount she needed to buy Amber's property at a forced sale, was to be split among the homeowners. The brochure, a masterpiece of marketing and manipulation, featured pictures of happy families, pristine homes, and a beautiful, sleek new dock that was, of course, to be built on Amber's property, which would be rezoned as a common area. It was a brazen, cynical move, a blatant attempt to use the community's money to steal Amber's land. Amber, armed with her grandfather's files and Frank's old surveys, saw through the ruse immediately. She knew that the community revitalization project was a sham, a thinly veiled legal maneuver to force her out. She knew that the cost was inflated and that the plans, which were conveniently vague, were a lie. She also knew that the community, which was for the most part made up of retirees living on fixed incomes, could not afford a $10,000 special assessment. She knew that a forced sale would be the result, and that Karen's LLC, Lakeside Development Solutions, would be the only bidder. It was a perfect, diabolical plan, and it was about to go into motion. But Amber was not going to let it happen. She went to the community meeting, a tense, silent affair held in the community clubhouse, with a box of her own, filled with her grandfather's files, the original plat maps, and a copy of the legal letter her lawyer had sent. She sat in the back, a quiet observer, as Karen Ponsonby, in a crisp navy blue pantsuit, stood at the podium, a charismatic force of nature, who spoke with the conviction of a true believer. She talked about the future of the community, about property values, and about the need for change. She showed the slick brochure, her voice a low, persuasive rumble, and she made it clear that this was the only way forward. She did not mention Amber by name, but she did talk about the need to deal with the difficult members of our community who are standing in the way of progress.
Then she opened the floor for questions. A few people, her sycophants on the board, spoke up in support of the plan. A few others, intimidated into silence, remained quiet. Then a voice from the back of the room, a clear, confident voice, spoke up. It was Amber. "I have a question, Karen," she said, standing up and holding her box of files. The room went silent. All eyes, including Karen's, turned to her. Karen's face, which had been a mask of practiced benevolence, now turned a shade of pale green. This was not in her script. "Amber," she said, her voice strained, "I don't believe this is the proper forum for personal matters." "It's not personal, Karen," Amber said, walking to the front of the room, her box of files a quiet, powerful presence in her hands. "It's a matter of community law, and a matter of your LLC." The room, which had been silent, now buzzed with whispers. Amber was a woman on a mission, and she was not going to be stopped. She placed the box on the table, opened it, and pulled out the original plat map. "This map," she said, holding it up for all to see, "was filed with the county in 1968. It shows that my grandfather's property, which is now mine, was not part of the original HOA.
It was annexed later with a special provision, a grandfather clause, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. It states that any changes to this property would require a 2/3 vote of the entire community, not just the board. Which, by my count, is a bit more than the 5 people you have on your board. She then pulled out the article from the Business Journal, the one about lakeside development solutions, and she held it up, her voice calm and steady. "And this," she said, her voice rising now, "is a news article about a company that specializes in acquiring lakeside properties, a company whose managing director is Karen Ponsonby. It seems, Karen, that you've been using your position as HOA president to harass me, to devalue my property, and to force a sale so that your own company could buy it for a fraction of its value. This community revitalization project is a sham. It's a fraudulent scheme to steal my land, and you were going to use the community's money to do it. You were going to force our neighbors, many of whom are on fixed incomes, to pay for your greed." The room erupted. People began to talk, to whisper, to stand up and demand answers. Karen, her face a mask of furious indignation, tried to talk over them, to regain control, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Amber had laid out all her cards, and she was not going to back down. The battle for the community, for her grandfather's legacy, was now a public spectacle, and it was about to reach its climax. Amber was not just a homeowner. She was a leader, a woman who had found her voice and was not afraid to use it. The community, which had been silent for so long, was now on her side, and they were ready to fight for their home, for their history, and for their future. The community clubhouse, which had been a quiet haven for coffee mornings and book clubs, had now been transformed into a courtroom, a public arena where a battle for the soul of the community was being waged. Amber stood at the front, a quiet but powerful presence, surrounded by a community that was now, for the first time in years, united. She had laid out her case with a quiet confidence that was a testament to her grandfather's legacy and her own burgeoning legal mind. She had shown them the plat maps, the old legal documents, the news article about Karen's LLC, and she had shown them that this was not a dispute over a red door, but a brazen attempted fraud. The crowd, which had been a sea of silent, intimidated faces, was now a chorus of angry voices, a tide of indignation that was about to wash over Karen Ponsonby. "The truth is a terrible weapon, but it's a beautiful one," her grandfather had often said. And in this moment, Amber knew exactly what he meant. Karen, standing at the podium, was a woman unraveled. The crisp navy blue pantsuit that had been a symbol of her power was now a costume, a flimsy attempt to hide the panicked, furious woman underneath. She tried to deny it, to claim that the LLC was a misunderstanding, a business venture that had nothing to do with her role as HOA president. But the words were hollow, a frantic scramble to regain control that was failing spectacularly. People were shouting questions at her, demanding answers about the special assessment, about the plans for Amber's property, about the endless barrage of fines. She was no longer a leader. She was a pariah, a woman exposed in the harsh light of truth. The turning point came when Frank, the retired land surveyor, stood up. He was an old man, a bit stooped, but his voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. "Karen," he said, his voice full of a quiet authority that silenced the room, "I've lived in this community for 50 years. I was here when this HOA was formed, and I was here when Amber's grandfather built his home. I surveyed this land myself, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that every single word Amber has said is true. Her grandfather's property is grandfathered in, the special assessment is a sham, and the LLC that you own, the one that you are going to use to buy her land, is a clear conflict of interest. You have used your position of power to bully, to intimidate, and to defraud this community, and for that, you should be ashamed." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen Ponsonby, a woman who had never been at a loss for words, had no response. She stood there, a solitary figure at the podium, her mask of authority shattered, her power evaporated. The community, which had been under her thumb for so long, had now turned on her, and the tide was too strong for her to resist. A woman from the back of the room, a sweet-faced grandmother who had been too afraid to speak before, now stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "My husband and I have lived on a fixed income for 10 years. We were going to lose our home because of your special assessment. We were going to lose everything. How could you do this to us?" Her words, a quieted accusation, were more damning than any legal document. Karen, her face now a mask of shame and fury, finally broke. She slammed her hand on the podium, her face contorted in a sneer. "Fine," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You want to live in a community of hippies and derelicts? Fine, you can have it. I quit, and I hope you all lose everything."
And with that, she grabbed her purse, pushed past the crowd, and stormed out of the clubhouse, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. The queen, it seemed, had abdicated her throne, and she had done so in a blaze of pathetic, self-destructive glory. Amber, standing in the front, watched her go, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. She hadn't just won, she had reclaimed the community. She had not only saved her own property, but she had also saved the homes of her neighbors, and she had restored the legacy of her grandfather. The community, which had been divided and intimidated for so long, was now a cohesive, united front, a group of people who had found their voice again. A man who had been one of Karen's strongest supporters on the board, a man who had clearly been intimidated into silence, now came up to her, his face a mask of shame. "Amber," he said, his voice low, "I'm so sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. I was so afraid of her, and I let her do this. Thank you. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Amber smiled. "It's okay," she said, her voice gentle. "My grandfather always told me that a hero is a man who is afraid, but he does it anyway. It's a lot harder to be a hero when you're alone, but you're not alone anymore." The crowd, which had been silent, now broke into applause, a wave of relief and gratitude washing over the room. They had been given a new lease on life, a new chance to be the community her grandfather had envisioned, a community built on respect, not on rules. Amber, a beautiful 25-year-old woman who had just inherited her grandfather's lakeside cabin with 4 acres of land and a dock on the lake, had not just won a legal battle, she had won a moral victory. She had proven that a beautiful 25-year-old woman could take on a powerful, corrupt HOA president and win, and she had done so with a combination of legal knowledge, an unwavering spirit, and the enduring wisdom of her grandfather. The battle was over, and the community was safe. The lakeside was once again a sanctuary, a place where people lived in the shelter of each other, and it was all because of her. The story of Amber was a testament to the power of one person to stand up to a bully and win. It was a story about a beautiful 25-year-old woman who, in the face of greed and corruption, found her voice, found her allies, and found her way home. Thanks for watching this episode from Daily Drama Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I would love to know how far our videos spread. We have a lot of great stories coming your way, so keep checking back. Before you go, please like the video and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, but it means a lot to me. Have a wonderful day, and remember, help each other and don't let the bullies win.